Hey guys, we are back with another episode of the Show Your Work series, where we talk to talented creatives about their work and techniques. This time we sat down with Toby Fox, another final year Illustrator student from Arts University Bournemouth. He is going to share his digital painting process with us and what inspires him to draw fairies, dragons and werewolves. Alright, so here we are again with Toby Fox this time, who is a digital artist, also studying at Bournemouth University.
Yes.
You are in your final year, just about to finish your studies.
That's it, yeah.
And we'll go through some of your work today and see how you approach each of your digital paintings and where you find inspiration and what are the topics and themes that you like to work on. So I think we can just jump straight into, first of all, your website. All the links will be in the description below. So if you want to check out Toby's website or Instagram, you can find these in the description below. Immediately, when I saw first your work, I could tell that you are a big fantasy fan, which is close to home because I'm also, I love fantasy in general. Have you always drawn fantastical creatures and stuff like that? Yeah. So
my earliest memory is sat drawing fairies in front of, I think I was watching like the Disney Sword and the Stone film and drawing fairies and wizards to that. And that's also my most recent memory, so it's...
Okay, so you're still there.
Nothing's changed,
At the course that you're studying, illustration, do you find it easy to adapt what you are learning and studying to this particular style? Or to phrase it differently, the lecturers, when they look at your work, can they actually accept this genre? Because this is quite like a specific style, specific direction that I wouldn't even call this illustration, it's more digital painting. So is this something that they are familiar with and they accept, or is this something that stands out a bit?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I'm probably the only digital painter who purely works like this on the course. With things like life drawing, that's really helpful because that's obviously working realistically and with proportion and things. So that feeds directly into my work really nicely. We also have, painting lessons and we'll work with acrylics or gouache or oils and things. So like in terms of techniques, it does. I've often had feedback and I've done projects where they've said, right, okay, put this down, try something else, see where it takes you. And I've done that. I've worked in ink or in graphite and done, various different styles. And I mean, that's some stuff on my Instagram for stuff in the past, but I've always come back to doing this sort of thing. And they're very especially in your final year, they want you to do work that you're going to enjoy because ideally that's what you'll be getting paid for. So they're not going to push you in a direction that you're not happy with. And one of my lecturers is a watercolor painter who works fairly realistically, and one is a 3D modeler who makes sort of not necessarily fantasy but more sci-fi stuff. So they touch on the borders of what I'm doing. And there are people, the course is very broad in itself. There are people who work just in single lines or in papier-mâché and things, who the tutors have nothing in common with. So I would say that's equally as different to standard illustration as what I do. So it's a good course at AUB for that it's super broad and you can go in lots of different directions.
And they give you the freedom to explore.
Yeah, definitely. Like a lot of the project work we do is exploring style and medium and genre and subject matter. It's, for me, the best thing about the degree is it's been 3 years to just explore and play and sort of find my visual identity or my voice or whatever.
You brought some working files with you, which we can have a look at. So I'll let you show us a bit more and tell us a bit more about these illustrations, or digital paintings.
Yeah.
This one, I think you have the line work as well here with you, which we can see. I guess that's a good place to start talking about it.
So it's quite a complicated thing to draw because there's lots of architecture and characters as well. I think there's 18 figures in the drawing plus a dragon and a puppy and a cat as well. there was a lot to work, and a shark and some jellyfish. Like there's a lot of individual elements to work out, and also to get them to fit within this 3D space. So it started with very heavy perspective grids and stuff, and like technical drawing, which isn't how I work now. But so I finished this at the very beginning of third year, so it would have been September of 2018. But I actually did the drawing in 2017, I think. So this was a very long work in progress. I don't spend a year on everything. Sure. But this piece I came back to every month or so. I'd do a bit more. It was a real labour of love. But yeah, and it was an exploration into world building, trying to have this sort of one place with a cohesive identity, but with lots of disparate peoples visiting it and sort of, doing different things, which you can see in the final image.
Roughly how long do you think it took? I know you've done it in pieces, but
it's really hard. For this, it's really hard to calculate. Like when I paint just a portrait or something, I can be like, okay, that was 4 to 5 hours, or a bigger piece is maybe 15. But this one, because there's so much in this, it was probably, I'd say somewhere between 35 and 50 hours for this, which is quite a lot.
Yeah, but you have, as you said, you have so many characters in there, which takes the most time to work out. Plus the perspective. Yeah, it's a complex piece for sure.
And having to take reference photos for all these characters, and stood there posing. But yeah, once I had the line drawing, I was able to do these value thumbnails, which for me are super helpful, because the first way you're going to read any painting is in terms of the value, the light and the dark. So that's how I try to begin when I'm doing things properly. So with this one, I was trying out different ways of lighting it to focus on the two figures in the foreground, who are bartering together. I think number 3 is the one I went with. Yeah, and it's just that like trying to be cinematic with it, deciding what gets hidden. So like the shark at the top, I don't want it to be the first thing you see, or any of the flying fish at all. So that's really like a secondary element. So a lot of those are in shadows and not really high contrast. Whereas the figure and the two figures in the foreground, I really want them to stand out, so they're lit against a dark background.
This is really interesting to see all of the different variations that you came up with, and it just shows that really when you work with light and shadows, it can really affect the mood. So even when you look at it in grayscale, it can completely change the atmosphere, and as you said, the storytelling aspect can really change depending on how you use light.
Yeah, the whole bottom row of these 6, those bottom 3, I think they make it look more duplicitous, because the figures are either in shadow or the whole place is nighttime. It looks like, something shady's going on. That's not what I want the story to be. It's look at this sort of bustling market, look at all these people, which is why I went with sort of a morning light. Even though the red guy with his dreads, he's his face is a bit in shadow, he's still lit enough that you can make out his expression. So even though he's looking dubious about the potion that he's potentially going to buy, there's still a sense of lightheartedness to it, I guess. So I took the grayscale image like this into Photoshop. So the thumbnail I just blew up to fit the document size. I had the line work like this on top, so I could know where everything was. And I whacked a color layer and some multiply layers and soft lights on top. And I tried to get something that looked decent. And I ended up with this, which doesn't look decent. So I ended up just going, okay, well, I know I want the female figure to have white hair and sort of purpley skin, and the male figure to have a reddy skin and dark hair. I know the tree's going to have green leaves. I want it to be morning, so the sky's going to be blue. The dome is gold. The buildings are marble. So that gave me an idea. And you can see in this, there's sort of purple colors and stuff in the marble, where especially in the shadow, it's reflecting that sort of blue tone. So instead of where I had just done soft light and multiply layers in Photoshop to try and insert color into the grayscale, I just picked the local colors of things and sketched them on like this. And you can see, especially in the gold dome up here, I was using a brush with, I think it's called color range on, where the hue shifts between each brush stroke. And in the wall here, there's stripes of different color, and even in that red band, there's a big blue stripe.
So you have already a lot of variety.
Yeah, so there's some randomness to that, which kind of it helps capture a traditional feel, so as if you were painting with oils or acrylics or something, and mixing on your palette and getting other pigments in. And then after that, it was a case of I haven't got the very first stage where it was just completely flat, white for the marble, green for the tree. But because that stage lasted sort of 5 minutes, and then it was a matter of just going in and doing like big brush strokes and things. And you can see, especially in like the leaves of the tree here, like that's a single brush stroke, and that's a single brush stroke, and that's a single brush stroke. Like there's lots of just chunks of it like that. Yeah, and then it was just a matter of like zooming in and detailing things up. So I think the first thing I did was the tree, the tree and bits of the background. So I knew there was water here, so reflecting the blue of that onto the underneath of the bark and making my brush smaller. I only use one brush usually. I'll sometimes use a big soft brush, but usually it's just, I think the default Photoshop chalk brush has some nice brush strokey texture to it. I know like there's the Kyle brushes and things which are much more painterly potentially, but I've never felt the need to use that really. I feel like for me, I've got the amount of texture I'm happy with at the moment with what I do. So, but it's, you know, it's always worth looking at those things. And then again, just so deepening shadows, making things a bit purpler and stuff, defining various elements, and it just, you know, slowly but surely gets more and more, you know, added in a few florally bits closer to the finish. And then that was it, yeah.
Cool.
You can see, I left the notes in this. So I knew just from the beginning, I had to do these notes so that I knew what every person's colour scheme would be, just to make sure I kept it in my head and so I could light them appropriately. So like, I used purple to show these sort of like grey-skinned, white-haired elves, and then the red I sketched on top to show that. And I leave myself in layers like that with notes in them all the time. I find it really helpful on a document, especially so you can go to bed and then come back to it and be like, oh, okay, that's what
yourself.
Yeah.
That's a very good practice, actually. So for this one, I'm just out of interest. Did you do the character sketches separately on paper or already directly in Photoshop?
I think so. The very first sketch I did, I don't know if it's in here. No, it won't be. The first thing I did was just a perspective grid like this.
Yeah, that was your 2-point perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And that with some good references of like ancient Greek marketplaces and stuff, that gave me an idea of the sort of thing I wanted, yeah. And then on top of that, I think I just drew a circle with a triangle underneath. I was like, okay, that's a person. Just so it's a really slow process for this one, especially where I was, you know, indicating figures with very little. And then I would sketch them in and then sketch on top of that until I got something that was near realistic. And then I would take a picture of myself or of a friend in the pose and then draw from that to make sure the anatomy was correct on things like, you know, obviously they're not wearing that much clothing, so those sort of things had to be referenced. Yeah, starting with perspective was key for this image. Yeah,
because it's there's so much architectural detail.
Yeah.
You had to get it right, and you wanted to obviously have so much depth in the painting. It's something that we talked about. You mentioning anatomy as well. We talked about this with George in our previous video, because he's doing more illustrative style and exaggeration. We discussed that anatomy is obviously very important. He's doing more like animals, so he's observing animals through like documentaries and looking at other artists as well to get inspiration from, but then he's always trying to pick out details that he can exaggerate. With the fantasy art digital painting style, it's more towards realism, like although it's not realistic creatures that you're drawing, but you need to get more realism in place. And I think that's why it's very important to do this very meticulous planning that you're doing here, in terms of doing both the perspective, getting references for your anatomy in the specific pose that you want to do. And then I really like the way you are thinking about colors as well, that you almost think of it as like rendering everything, almost like 3D, the ambient light, the local light.
So you can even see my layers are called like color render, because I do think of it like the more you know about light, like and color and how they sort of function, there's more that you have to process, like a rendering software. And, you know, when you're putting in bounce lights and ambient lights and occlusion and all sorts of those things, and the more you're aware of that sort of stuff, the more steps there are. But obviously with time and with practice, like it just becomes second nature. So learning about 3D and rendering in general will help you a lot about understanding color and light. The same with like photography. If you learn about photography, can help you tremendously in composition and again understanding how to use or utilize light. So
just like with everything, the more different type of things you learn and practice, they all come together and in a way help each other. I can see already that you are thinking about doing your digital paintings from a 3D rendering perspective, which is great. And it shows in the quality of your work. You actually have another piece that you brought.
I do, yeah. Slightly darker, this one, in terms of values as well as theme. With this one, it was... I thought this would be an interesting one to show because it was the first I did where I wasn't starting with a drawing. I had a sketch like this, which only really I could do because I've drawn so much that I now have sort of like ingrained in me to some degree. Like, I'm not brilliant or the best by any means, but I can draw a figure now quite quickly from my imagination. And also there's no architecture in this, it's trees and snow and stuff.
More organic.
It's more organic form, so it was easier. So this was very like, I blocked in with just digital paint, whacked in some stuff, basic shapes, basic characters. Yeah, I did a couple variations where I think I painted the top left one first and then chopped it around and expanded things and shrunk stuff. And it was a really quick way for me to create an image, and this is how I work now. I've gotten rid of drawing unless I need to do something really precise. So like architecture I would. But then also if I'm doing it, it will be sort of halfway through the image at the same sort of stage that I would gather reference. So I'll get all my ideas down first in value and color, block them out like these, and then from those I might draw on top of it or draw into it just to give myself guidelines where I need it, where I can't do it from like knowledge I already have or references that I have. And again, like this is, even though there's figures in this, like obviously there's werewolves too, which you can't get reference for. So it's more finding, lots of pictures of wolves, lots of pictures of big muscly dudes and trying to meld the two. So it's again more of a process there where you're not just drawing observationally. So then I just sort of painted on top of it, which looks like quite a jump, but I've got the layer. This is what I painted on top. So you can see like...
Interesting.
Yeah, where the trees are, especially the ones at the borders, there's very little that I did to change them. They were basically, the big shape was enough. And then where the figures are, again, like there's bits of them which are really worked up, especially on these two main figures here. But like this guy in the background, the hunched over werewolf, you can see he's got loads of holes in his layer, and it's because the original underneath
rough sketch was enough.
Yeah, it was enough.
That's a really interesting, like these, just using two layers, one which is your original rough.
I went back in and corrected just a tiny bit of anatomy there.
But yeah, essentially it's made up of those two layers, the thumbnail and an overpaint on that. This is a very, very smart method and way of working. I've seen some other artists doing it as well. And essentially this is also similar to oil painting, where you would have your underlay and then that dries and then you can paint over it and so on and so forth. But
the difference is that I can preserve the underlay just for the sake of documentation. I can have that.
Even if you completely covered it up, you can still reveal it. I often get that question from people, especially who wants to get into digital art, like, what's the ideal amount of layers? Now, this is a hard thing to reply to, whether you use Procreate or Photoshop or whatever else you are using. I think it's really a personal choice.
Definitely.
Because I know many amazing artists who would have loads of layers, hundreds sometimes. While I know also artists, also very successful artists, who work literally on one single layer, on the background layer, no additional layers needed. Your previous example had more layers because you were building up your colors mainly, but even there I could already tell that you don't actually need that many layers, so you don't separate your artwork in so many different layers. I also started out drawing with lots of layers, and then as I got more into it, I realized that actually less is a bit easier to manage.
Yeah, definitely.
And I'm much more flexible in terms of what I can redraw, because when I have so many layers, I'm so precious about keeping everything separate. And this way, and this is a perfect example as you showed it, that having the thumbnail removed shows that a lot of details are not important to go over completely, because if you have everything in focus, every little detail in the same intensity and detail, it's going to be too hard to read.
Yes,
so you need that variation between the detailed parts and the parts that are more like just in the background, almost like a depth of field would work in photography.
It's that idea.
Yeah, and then these two layers, I think, is a perfect example of showing that how it works. I love the fact that you have in the mouth of the werewolf, like, is it the same face or is it someone else's face?
It's similar faces. It's the idea was it's like children turning into the werewolves. If it were sort of cinematic, I would think like they would transform and the last thing would be the wolf's head would like close over their face.
And then the face disappears.
And then it's like swallowed in. So I wanted to sort of show that. And but again, like it's not super explicit. So it's about hinting about that, you know, and so you can see like there's still a human hand and things.
And
so,
there's another character in the background as well.
Yeah, I think there's one elsewhere. There's like little figures everywhere. But it's like what you were saying, if everything was on separate layers, it would be, see there's another one in the trees up there. If I drew everything on separate layers, each character I think would become very like boom, here's a character, boom, here's another character. Whereas if it's all worked into one, and which works especially for painting, like things blend in. Like it would be different if it was graphic design or something, then you don't necessarily want everything to fade away. But yeah, when I first started, like I would do eyelashes on a separate, there'd be a layer for eyelashes and then a layer for the whites of the eye and then a layer for the pupil. Like it was just too much. Like when you do that, you'll spend all your time thinking about layers and not thinking about what you're drawing. So yeah, I got with confidence in image making and painting, I limited the layers down and, you know, eventually it was a character and a background layer or a character and an object, and, you know, and then just more, especially in this last year or so, everything on basically one layer. It's just, or two, if I want to maintain the thumbnail or the underpainting. That's
really interesting to see, and it's good that you showed both of these examples because it's slightly different things that we could talk about on them. Sure. Just as a general like composition in terms of this painting, I really like how you managed to get the highest contrast on the focal point where we have obviously the main characters. Using the moonlight and then the dark details around it really helps to read the silhouette of this character. But also I like the slight tilt in the whole image. I don't know whether that was intentional or not, but it feels like there's a slight angle. So it almost feels like a bit like we are hiding somewhere. It feels like something bad is going to happen to us.
That's the idea, Good. I'm glad it works.
Because it's definitely something dynamic, like you have so much movement in it. Also love the way the trees giving so much momentum and flow into it. And another interesting thing is that just like with details, and when you add too much detail in a painting, you lose interest and it's not going to work. Here again, the contrast you use very sparingly. So you have a high contrast detail, the moon, and around the moon the trees, but then obviously the main central figure. But then a lot of the characters, like the wolves or werewolves, they almost blend into the dark surroundings. I mean, just by seeing their eyes, I can see that they are there. But on a first read, some of these details might not even appear just when the viewer starts to really start discovering them. So I think that's also a very advanced technique, or people further along the line when they do digital painting, they realize that actually these secondary read details are so important.
The more you can get your audience to do for you, the better. Like the less I have to paint and the more I can get whoever's looking at it to fill in the gaps. That's better for me because it means I don't actually have to know what a wolf looks like, for example. Like it can just, if I can do a silhouette of a wolf, that's all I need. And like most of the wolves in the background are just, I think they're literally two colors, just a light color and two very dark colors, but a lighter and a darker one. And that's enough. And I went back in and I took a large round soft brush and had it randomized so it would do different sizes with each stroke, and did these sort of layers of smoke on top and fog to obscure characters even more and like recede them back. They're not important. And even on the like main characters, the little guy in the front, like he's floating, his feet aren't touching I say he's meant to be androgynous, so it's either or, but like the feet aren't touching the floor, and I really don't think that's a detail you'd notice unless you're really looking for it. And because it's not important to the story. Like the main elements that I wanted to show are like child figure, werewolf, moon, forest. Like that's the story in its barest bones, and so those are the bits where the contrast is. And if you can sort of think through that when you're making an image, and you can just be like, okay, so there's got to be a figure here. The moon is behind him, so he's going to be a dark shadow, right? So the ground that he's on has to be light. Cool. What's light? Snow. Perfect. Like it's very logical thought processes then, which is when sketching is good. Like if you can be drawing and stuff, it's whilst you're thinking. I find that's the best way. I also sometimes write. I find that helps if I'm describing a scene in a written way, because you then have the essential elements. You know, if I was writing a scene, the child floated up and a wolf was behind him, but I wouldn't say there was a branch which had a particular type of bark on it and it had 47 leaves on it, because that's not relevant. So I won't also draw those things in because they're not relevant to the story. So I can just hint at them at most, or not even show them at all, and let the audience be like, oh, it's a forest, so there will be wood, and then I don't have to paint it.
That's also interesting.
Yeah.
So because doing this, you are essentially a visual storyteller.
Yeah.
But using actual writing can help to get your thoughts together.
Definitely.
And so once again, these things are all can help the process.
Oh yeah, there's overlaps in anything you do. Even just walking somewhere, like a walk to uni or a walk to town, or cooking something is enough for me to have images building in the back of my mind, and I can just sort of let them sift around, and I'll be like, a dragon. I'll draw another one of those. And then it's, and you just let these things ruminate, and then when you get to sketching, you've realized you had so many more ideas, and it's just a matter of getting them out. And for me, that's become easier and easier with time. I found the biggest barrier for me before was this not having the skill to do something. So I'd think, it'd be so cool to have this floating vampire woman with great big bat wings, and there's loads of figures around her, and they're all covered in blood, and it's lit by moonlight, and but then if your first thought is, then after having the idea, how, it doesn't, that's such a big barrier of entry. Whereas if your thought is, okay, what's it going to look like, rather than how do I draw a person? So that's why things like life drawing as well are really good, or just getting decent reference, so that you can, those questions are answered for you, the difficult ones or the boring ones, of what does an arm look like in this pose, or what does a leg look like, or that's answered for you by reference or study, which again takes time even with it. The interesting bit is obviously the storytelling.
Cool. I really like these ones as well. I remember when you showed me first in your portfolio. So here the concept was to do monochrome creatures.
Yes.
And you've done 18 illustrations. You wanted to also create this contemporary feel using fashion photography as an inspiration. So
which is very different to the look of a fully painted scene, which was, I think I started these after finishing the big market scene that I was showing you before. And I was like, this took me so long, this is a really big image. It's really painterly, it's really textured, there's lots of color, there's lots of figures. It's a lot. What's the most bare bones, basic way I can show fantasy, which is the genre I'm interested in, obviously. And it was okay, figure, no background. And when looking at, so I was using Pinterest a lot. I use Pinterest all the time. Images that I found like that were fashion editorials and things, where it would be a plain background or a very simple background. And so I was like, cool, I really like how these look. Let's try and work this into something.
This is also another very good exercise of trying to think outside of the box and don't try to repeat that others already done. You probably have several artists whose work you love in the same genre. But then you will also find imagery which is completely different, like you said. But then apply the aesthetics, what you like in those, to the style in which you are more interested in. I really like this, and I think you should do more of these, because you can see the potential combining these two styles, especially what you choose as your cover art. I love the composition on that. Is that harpy?
That's exactly it,
I really like the composition on that, but I also like this minotaur character, such an unusual composition. Usually you would have them raging with two axes in their hands. But here it's a very calm pose, very symmetrical, and very unusual basically. And especially having a completely white, almost albino.
That was the idea.
The character with a black background. I think there's a lot of very interesting ideas in here. So are you planning to continue this series?
It's maybe not this series, but certainly working this way, it's really fun. I can do one of these quite quickly as well, sort of 5 hours to 8 hours ish, because it's just one figure and then a simple background. So it's a fun one to have.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's pretty much all we have time for today.
Awesome.
I hope the viewers will enjoy this video, and of course in the description below we have all the links, so if you want to check out Toby's work you can find that. You can follow him on Instagram, and also you can use the comments below to ask any questions and Toby will be able to answer. Or if you have any questions towards us, we will also keep an eye on the comments. If you like this format and if you're interested or finding out about certain art styles, or you want to see certain parts of the process in a bit more detail, let us know, and then we can try to cover that in next time when we sit down with another artist. But that's all for today. So Toby, thank you so much for joining, and I love your work and I wish you all the best, and I will be also keeping an eye on what you will be working on.
Thank you. It's been great fun. Thanks.
Let us know in the comment section what would you like us to cover next time on this series. Click on the link in the description or the join button to become a member if you want to work on future projects with us and see the whole design or illustration process live. Thanks a lot for watching. Like and share this video if you enjoyed it. Have fun learning, guys, and I will see you in the next one.